Welcome everyone to our session, What We Learned from Papermill to Operationalize Notebooks. To get started, let me just start off with an introduction of myself. My name is Alan Yu. I'm a program manager from Microsoft working on the Azure Data Studio team. And I'm joined today by our engineer, Vasu Bhog, who will be demoing the more interesting part of this presentation. We'll be showing the code that we've been using to build out this experience. But to get started, let's kind of talk about the problem that we're trying to solve. And when you kind of think about your internal teams or just businesses in general, there's a lot of instances where you have a team that's dedicated to internal troubleshooting. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of issues that may have appeared in the past. So for example, you may have some text lying around in like a Word doc or in OneNote just lying around, and it's just like, it's almost like you have to know where everything is. There's a system behind it. It's very hard to find these things. There's no version control. It's really hard to share any of the code or results in order to handle this troubleshooting. It's very hard to search for things. And these are all kind of problems that we just want to take a moment to think about. This is what exists today, and how can we, looking forward, how do we improve this experience? And so, we kind of noticed that there were some general patterns that in these kind of buckets as we thought of a solution to this troubleshooting issue. And we realized that it came down to these three main things. We wanted to find a solution that was highly interactive so that, things aren't just like easily outdated very quickly. We want to make sure that anything that we share, whether it's results or sample code, things like that, is very accessible. And then we also want to make sure that any pipeline that we build for troubleshooting is highly maintainable. And so as we kind of thought of different solutions, one thing we discovered was notebooks, and how we realized that this really highly interactive document is just a really powerful way to be a key piece of this pipeline. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with notebooks, notebooks are simply these highly interactive documents that include both code cells that you can execute, such as like Python cells, for example, and they could lead to some kind of output. But it also is accompanied by these rich text cells, which are powered by Markdown. And by having this deep combination, you can easily be able to have this document that you can share with various folks, whether they need to do a little bit more coding, or if they simply are just looking for the results of these notebooks to share off with other folks on the team. And as you can imagine, if we were to make notebooks a core piece of this troubleshooting pipeline, this is almost what it would look like. So let's start off with Roger, who is a data engineer and a DBA working with this tool called Azure Data Studio. And it's through Azure Data Studio that they can go ahead and create this troubleshooting guide notebook and then publish these notebooks to a GitHub repo. So it's very easy to have source control behind any of the troubleshooting guides that are built on there and easily shareable with other folks on the team. And then we think about Tim, who is on the support team, where he goes ahead and creates a task, assigns it to a DBA, and then it triggers these kind of actions across a certain pipeline and leads to this automation where at the end of it, it actually will create this troubleshooting guide notebook, or it will create an output file with this notebook that can then be shared with other people on the team, such as by adding a URL to this notebook output. Gloria, as a DBA, could then view that task and also the URL to the notebook, which they could then open inside of Azure Data Studio and see the results of it. And you can kind of see that, in this kind of vision, notebooks are the key to this automation and touches all across the different folks on the team and their various skill sets as well. But in order to kind of build this, really wonderful solution, you have to start off with the building blocks. And one core piece is this parameterization experience. So parameterization, simply in this example, is the ability to be able to pass values from a URL or from a notebook to another notebook, or even between code cells within a notebook itself. And as we kind of thought about designing this experience with already the notebook experience we have in Azure Data Studio, there's no better place to start than with the open source community. And so, as our team has been more and more involved with contributing to GitHub and building more of our tools in open source, we came up with these kind of design principles as we were kind of building out this experience. And one was to leverage open source as much as possible, and there's no reason for us to rebuild everything on our own. On top of that, whatever we do build custom, we want to make sure there's backwards compatibility with all other Jupyter viewers out there. And then finally, iterate quickly. So have a crawl, walk, run approach, and also make sure to work with open source influencers out there in order to kind of make sure that we're not creating anything that will break things in the ecosystem. And of course, one thing that we've realized, and a company that's really spearheaded this, like Netflix, is Papermill. And so I'm going to hand this over to Vasu, who will go into a little bit more detail about Papermill.
Thanks, Alan. So I'll be discussing the parameterization demos that we currently support, as well as up-and-coming new ideas for parameterization. Our main focus for parameterization was to become compatible with Papermill, as well as enhancing the experiences of automating and parameterizing notebooks in Azure Data Studio. First, we will look at Papermill's approach and how we understood and leveraged their foundations that led us to evolve our notebooks. Papermill lets us parameterize and execute notebooks. In order to do that, we need to ensure that we follow their two fundamental concepts. Tagging a cell with the tag parameters indicates that you would like to make this notebook to be parameterized. This will ensure that when you execute the notebook using either the Papermill Python API or the Papermill command line execution, it will inject the new parameters properly after the designated parameter cell. So let's see how this is done in Jupyter Notebook so that we can visually see how we tag parameter cells. So here we have a very simple notebook, which is X and Y and arithmetic and print statements. And now we can really visually see how we utilize parameterization. So here, in order to see the tags, we go to View, Cell Toolbar, Tags. And we can actually see that X and Y are stated as the parameters. And therefore, we'll be able to inject new values for these specific parameters. Now let's go to Azure Data Studio to understand how we implemented a very similar concept. So we did the same conceptualization of, indicating a cell as parameters. And by doing so, all the user will have to do is go to the more toggle for this specific cell and make it a parameter cell. So we have the exact same content, exact same tag functionality. And now we can go ahead and run this notebook and see that the addition and multiplication is outputted as that. And now, in order to understand that, how this looks in the metadata side of the notebook, we can go ahead and just look at it, take a quick peek. And so X and Y are stated here, and within the metadata for that specific cell, we see it's tagged as parameters. So therefore, when we go ahead and use the Python API execution, it will know where to inject the parameters, the newly injected parameters. So here, we're going to use the import for Papermill and execute notebook functionality, where we put an input path as well as our desired output path for that specific notebook, and then indicate the new parameter values that we want to utilize. So go ahead and run this, and then we can see that execution has completed, and now we can open up that new output notebook and see visually that the injected parameters are stated clearly, as well as the new X and Y values. The parameter cell is still there, indicating that we had parameterized that notebook from the original input. And the new values for this results are all solely based on the new injected parameters values. We can also use the command line interface for Papermill, utilizing Papermill input, output, -p for individual parameters, and setting the same format, but we'll get the exact same result. So we saw incredible potential with Papermill and how it can be used for many different notebook scenarios. Within Azure Data Studio, we not only wanted to integrate Papermill foundational approach, but we wanted to implement new methods to parameterize notebooks. So one of the ways that we actually did was utilizing the notebook URI and programmatically adding these parameters. So here you can see that this is our ADS notebook URI handler. And in order to parameterize a notebook, a user would add their specific location of their notebook, for instance on GitHub or a remote location. And then in order to inject those, all a user would have to do is append this query at the end of that notebook and state which values that they would like to change. So here we have the same exact concept of x equals 1, ampersand indicating a new parameter value, and y with a new value as well. So here we can go ahead back into Azure Data Studio, go ahead and see on our URI parameterization, closing our input notebook so we don't have to see if it's actually there or not. And we can actually see our location of our GitHub notebook as well, right? And so this notebook is something we want to parameterize. So we can go ahead and actually utilize that handler, pass it in the same way into a URL here, and say we want to inject the same values. So go ahead, open up Azure Data Studio. It recognizes that we're going to open up the same URI. Here we just download that file from that location and inject that new values based on that query at the end. So here you can clearly see that we did the exact same concept. We can run all the cells, see the exact same values from those results, and clearly understand that we follow Papermill's foundational parameterization, but incorporated it to leverage what we already implemented and now what we can also further implement. So from here, we really wanted to see how we can continue on this parameterization journey within Azure Data Studio, where we wanted to tie in all these different forms of parameterization and implement something that was very seamless to the user, and utilize our components within our notebook interface and create a simple run experience for parameterizing a notebook. And this is where our new action, run with parameters, comes in. This new action can parameterize a notebook all within this Azure Data Studio notebook. So we can quickly see here a demo of what it kind of would look like in terms of using this action. So as we see and as we've shown, the parameter cell here is just simple X and Y statement. So we can quickly go ahead and just utilize this functionality in this new button called Run with Parameters, and it will identify the parameter cell within the notebook and ask the user if they would like to change the variable and parameter value. So we're gonna say, let's change it to 10 again and Y to 20. And now I'll quickly execute and create that new parameterized notebook with the injected parameter cell, all while ensuring that we're continuously compatible and remaining on that structured foundational step of inserting this injected parameter cell after the parameter cell has been identified in the metadata. So there's quite a bit of nuance, of what we've taken from the start of Papermill to what we have now. And so now let's show an even more advanced example of parameterization. So here we're actually utilizing KQL magic, which allows us to run analysis using KQL and connect to an Azure Data Explorer cluster. So here we can see that this cluster specifically, and what we're going to look into, is storm events from the sample database. And here we actually stated the state filter to be Georgia, so that's what we're actually going to be looking at. And from here, we actually ran this notebook already, since it is a bit long, to just understand what this notebook contains. So we load the KQL magic, we set up the connection to the cluster, and indicate that's the sample database that we want to actually look into. And now here, I just quickly wanted to see what type of data we have within this storm events. And so we can clearly see here the different states, the different event types, injuries, damage property, different items that all within this database itself. And so now we can see there's a bunch of this, 59,000 storm events. So we can really get granular towards what we want to understand. So here, this is how we actually utilize the parameters into our KQL query, all within this notebook. So what we have to do is just state that state filter that we set to Georgia is set to this state. And then that's when we pass it into our query for KQL magic to understand that we're only looking for storm events of Georgia. So it seems like Georgia had quite a bit of thunderstorm wind, drought, hail, and many different other storm events. And we can really chart this even by looking at what the data would look like on a render chart. And this is all very similar to Plotly. So this is all produced with Plotly. And here we can actually granularly just go even further in, say we only want to look closer to certain dates. It's all very interactive in this approach. So now let's say we want to go back up and add a new parameter, let's say for a new state. So all we're going to have to actually do is indicate within or using our run with parameters action what state we actually want to do. So let's say I'm currently living in Washington State. So let's do Washington. And now the part that we have to do here is actually we have to rerun the notebook for it to actually be executed. So it will be just quick, understanding of reloading KQL magic, setting up the connection. And in order to do that, we actually have to authenticate in our browser. So it's a very quick and easy, just copy and paste the code that's already pasted in. You can sign in with your email address that will allow you to connect to the Kusto client, and then just authenticate there, all within that space for us to leverage this Kusto Azure Data Explorer cluster and get that data. So I authenticated. Now we get the same kind of understanding of the data. And we can come down here, and now we can quickly see for Washington State we had heavy snow and during this time period, heavy wind, other factors and storm events as well. And now when we look at the render chart, and we actually can even compare with Georgia, for example, and just panning out for more understanding. So we can go back and understand that's kind of the date frame, and see that, for Washington State, it had much less severe storm events during this time period as compared to the storm events of Georgia. So there's a lot that we can leverage here with parameterization, quickly parameterize notebooks, utilizing different formats that we already laid out to you of Papermill's approach using the Python API and command line interface, using our URI parameterization, which you can store this actual notebook in GitHub, different locations, and just call it with our Azure Data Studio notebook URI handler. And then now we have this run with notebooks action. So this all really ties in to how we're continuously looking at Papermill and started on that framework of targeting that cell as parameters, and then going and seeing what more implementations we can really do to help users integrate and have a more ease of use with notebooks, specifically parameterizing them and then executing them in automated fashions. So from here, we've developed and integrated many different parameterization actions, as well as usability that not only focuses on the foundations that Papermill has set up for us and leverage those to enhance our parameterization within notebooks for Azure Data Studio. So we shown all of that, and now we really wanted to understand what more and what it could be next for parameterization. So one of our goals and our next kind of items that we wanted to look at was global parameterization. So parameterizing multiple notebooks that are all contained in a Jupyter book using global parameters. And we really wanted to take this a bit further by utilizing, the Jupyter Books open source project as well, and creating those global parameters to continue with the Papermill's open source approach and really combine those two together. This will allow us to really take a notebook, take a Jupyter book, and set a set of parameters and open that notebook that is already known knows what those parameters would be. So let's go ahead and look at what a prototype of that would be as we continue doing user studies on this as well. So here we have Azure Data Studio, and we're going to be opening a new Jupyter book here. So we'll click Weather Analysis as we kind of have shown. And now we open that Jupyter book. As you can see, it's a different, it's a book here and with many different notebooks. Now we'll click on the first notebook, similar to that of what we just tested. So the storm weather analysis. And from here, what we wanted to do is set this book to look at, for all of these notebooks, a specific state. So we're going to right click that book and say set as parameters. Now we can say set parameters for Jupyter book. And these are setting the parameters for the entire book as indicated. And all we're going to do is adding the state filter in Georgia. And so when we press set, now this current notebook that we currently open will automatically add this parameter cell, as there was none initially. So now we already seen the results for Georgia, and we wanted to test something else. So now we can just go back and use a run with parameters action. Instead of Georgia, we can do, let's say, Michigan, right? And that will open up a new notebook, as we just showed, with the injected parameters. So it's all a nice seamless process from going from a global setting to a new run for that specific notebook, right? And we can compare those analysis as well. Now let's say we actually wanted to just see the other annual rainfall. So as you can see, we actually still illustrate that the global parameters is still set for this notebook as well. So that's what we intend to do, and we really want to look forward to getting more feedback regarding this approach, since we're looking to improve parameterization, automation as a whole, in order to operationalize these notebooks for many different cases. And so tying this all back into a good state was continuously implement different parameterization functionalities that both makes it easy for the user, as well as our notebook environment that focuses on parameterization. These demos illustrate all our parameterization efforts and how we start off with Papermill compatibility and work towards global parameterization, all within the context of Azure Data Studio and Papermill's open source framework. And we'll continue to learn and implement new ways to operationalize notebooks.
Thanks, Vasu, for that wonderful demo showing off parameterization. One thing that we really want to emphasize throughout this presentation of this wonderful work we've been working on is that whatever we build, we want to contribute back to the open source community. So even though this is just one area of potential collaboration, we have been working for the last couple of years with the Jupyter Nteract community with many of the maintainers and influencers out there. And I have also presented at other conferences like JupyterCon in the past to really make sure that things that we would like to see that our customers could benefit from could also benefit the rest of the open source community. So we've built things like a SQL kernel that has IntelliSense and syntax highlighting and those type of experiences, and we'd love to make this available for the rest of the community one day, especially through a project like .interactive, which is all MIT licensed and is really working on this polyglot story. But this is something we want to continue to invest in by working with the open source community, and we would just love to kind of just share with you just from what we learned from Papermill today to kind of lead to what our customers are benefiting from going forward. And so if you're curious about the work that we're doing around notebooks and working with the open source community, I encourage you to reach out to these different links. You can check out our project for Azure Data Studio on GitHub. You can also just learn more about our notebooks and play around with them yourself, including our dedicated SQL kernel. And then also you can follow us on Twitter at Azure Data Studio. And yes, thank you so much for your time. Any questions?